Pranks by Robert Bloch. The lights came on just after sunset. He stood in the hallway near the front door, filling the candy dish on the table with a skill born of long practice. How many times had he done this? How many Halloweens had he spent preparing for joyful hours of this evening ahead? No use trying to remember, he'd lost count. Not that it mattered, really. What mattered was the occasion itself. The few hours of magic and make-believe one was privileged to share with the children. What mattered was the opportunity, however brief, to enter into the spirit of things, participate in the let's pretend on the night of the year when childless couples could themselves pretend they were truly no different from the members of the community around them. Solid, ordinary citizens who took pride in their homes and their offspring. Actually, it wasn't all pretense. He was proud of his house, and rightfully so, for it was the one he had designed and created right down to the last knick-knack and stick of furniture, and they had always loved children. But to tell the truth, it was make-believe. That thrilled him. Maybe they both had a childish streak of their own, dressing up to surprise the youngsters, and part of the fun was surprising one another, for it was the unspoken rule that neither of them never or ever revealed in advance what sort of costume they'd be wearing. Now, hearing footsteps on the stairs, his eyes brightened in eager anticipation. One year she'd come sailing down the steps in a hoop-skirt Scarlet O'Hara. Another time she'd gotten herself a black-braided Pocahontas. Once she'd worn the powdered wig of Marie Antoinette. What would he see tonight? Cleopatra? The Empress Josephine? Joan of Arc? Leave it to her to fathom his expression and astonishment with him, the unexpected. And that, as she descended into full view, was exactly what she did. For instead of a figure out of a film or fiction, he beheld a little old lady with a motherly smile wearing an apron over a simple house dress, as though she'd just stepped out of an old-fashioned country kitchen. "How do you like it?" she said. For a moment he stared at her, completely taken aback, yet puzzled at the oddly familiarity of her appearance. Where had he seen this smiling elderly woman before? Then suddenly, his gaze darted down towards the candy dish on the table and the empty box that lay beside it. And there, on the front of the box, was his answer. The oval photographic portrait purporting to represent the candy maker herself. Tonight, she was Mrs. C. Now it was his turn to smile. "Marvelous," he said. "It's hard for me to imagine you as an old lady, but I must say you look the part." She nodded, pleased with his reaction. "I think the kids will like it too. And they certainly should be able to recognize you too, Ben." He peered at her through his tiny rimless spectacles and patted his paunch. "I hope so. At least I make a better Ben Franklin than my last year's Abraham Lincoln. Though I admit I was tempted to try something different for a change. Remember when I did Adolf Hitler? It scared half the children out of their wits?" She shook her head. "Halloween's for fun, not fright. No, I think you made a good choice." She bustled over to the table, inspecting the mound of chocolate heaps in the candy dish. I see you've done my job for me." "That's right," he paused, listening to the sudden chiming of the grandfather clock beside the stairs. 7:30, they should start coming." Then the doorbell rang. She opened the door. The two of them stood side by side, gazing down at the little ragamuffin in a cowboy outfit as he clutched his crumpled shopping bag and rattled off the time-honored greeting, "Trick or treat," he said. She stepped back, smiling. "Isn't he adorable?" she murmured. Then, "Come right in and help yourself. The candy's on the table." The moment the front door closed, Joe Stutman turned to Maggie, scowling. "Jesus H. Christ," he said. "Now, Joe, please," Maggie sighed. "Don't get yourself upset over nothing." "You call that nothing?" His scowl and voice deepened. "Those damn costumes must have cost a fortune. I'm not blind, you know. I read the ads. Okay, so most of Angela's witch outfit you made for yourself, but why the hell did you have to go and buy Robbie that fancy shiny spacesuit?" "Simmer down," Maggie told him. "You don't have to pay for it. I've been saving up my household allowances for 2 months. "So that's it?" Joe shook his head. "No wonder we've been eating so many of those lousy casserole messes lately. I work my tail off down at the shop, and all I get to eat is glog because your son has to dress up like some goddamn astronaut for Halloween." "Our son," Maggie said. "Robbie is a good boy. You saw his last report card. All those A's mean he's really been doing his homework. And he still finds time to help me around the house and do yard work for you. I think he deserves a treat once in a while." "Treat?" Joe went over to the coffee table in front of the television set, picked up his six-pack resting there, and then yanked one off of the beer cans. That's another thing I don't like, this trick-or-treat business, running up and down the street all night, knocking on doors asking for a handout. I don't care what kind of fancy get-up the kid's wearing. What he's really doing is acting like some sort of wino on Main Street, a bum mooching off strangers. You call that good behavior? It's nothing but blackmail, if you ask me. He thumbed the tab of his beer can. Trick or treat, it's a real treat, isn't it? Pay up or else. What are you training Robbie for, to grow up and join the mafia? For heaven's sake, Maggie said. You don't have to go on a roll about it. You know just as well as I do trick or treat is just a phase or a phrase. People expect kids to ask for candy or cookies on Halloween. It's just a tradition, that's all. And if somebody doesn't come through with a treat, I'm sure neither Robbie nor Angela is going to do anything about it. They're just going to go to another house. She glanced unhappily towards the front door. I only wish you'd let me put out a few goodies for the kids that come here. No way, Joe said. He took another gulp of beer. I thought we had that settled. I'm not wasting my money on a mess of junk food for a bunch of little bastards who dress up in stupid Halloween costumes and come banging on my front door. But Joe, you heard me. Joe scooped up the six-pack with his free hand. Now let's get those lights turned off quick before anyone shows up. I'm going to watch the game on the set in the bedroom, and I don't want any interruptions. That means don't answer the door. Do you read me? Yes, Maggie said, I read you. Wearily, she turned around and started down the hallway towards the kitchen as Joe turned the living room lamp off behind her. Do you read me? What a stupid question. Of course Maggie could read Joe. She'd been reading him like a book these past 12 years, and there were no surprises waiting for her. The stinginess, the rages, the insensitivity to the needs of others, all were part of the old story she'd come to know only too well. Sighing softly, Maggie began to stack the dishes in the sink. As she did, she reminded herself that she had to be fair. Joe did work awful hard, and he tried to protect his family. And as a husband, he probably did better for her than most. In spite of his faults, Joe was a good man. And maybe that was the trouble. He was a good man. A man who never seemed to enjoy his childhood, and who couldn't share in the fun with his own children that they wanted to enjoy with him. So it was up to her to see that they had a little fun in their lives, like tonight, Halloween, a fun time for kids like Robbie and Angela. She hoped they were having a good time. Perhaps when they grew up with families of their own, they'd still be able to enjoy harmless holidays. It seemed to take forever for the twins to get ready. Pam's devil costume was too tight and had to be let out the waist before she could get zipped in the back, and Debbie kept fussing with her own clown makeup. In point of fact, they didn't actually leave the house until almost 8:15, but within 3 minutes after their departure, Chuck and Linda Cooper were in bed. Alone at last, Linda giggled. My God, you'd think it was some sort of kind of floozy sneaking around like this, waiting for the chance to hop in the sack at the moment the coast is clear. Be it floozy, Chuck said. Come on, I dare you. Don't get me wrong, Linda sobered. You know how much I love the kids, and we both do, but lately it seems like we never get a chance what with their bedroom right next to ours and these damn mattress springs squeaking. I'm always afraid that they're going to hear us. So let them hear, Chuck grinned. About time they learned about the facts of life. Linda shook her head. But they're still so young. Maybe I'm too self-conscious, I don't know. It's the way I was brought up, I guess, and I can't help it. Look, let's not talk about it now, shall we? Chuck tossed the covers aside. I'm not going to spend the next 2 hours worrying about whether or not the springs squeak. Sorry, Linda said. I know how tight things are right now and the way the prices keep going up and you not getting a raise until next year. But if we could only afford a new mattress, I'll buy you one for Christmas. How about that? Oh, Chuck, she turned on him, smiling. Do you really mean it? Of course I mean it. One new mattress for Christmas. That's a promise. But right now, you've got another holiday to celebrate, remember? He took her into his arms. Happy Halloween, he said. Sometime around 9:30, Father Carmichael checked his watch. Getting late, he said. Should really be going. I thank you both for a lovely dinner and a delightful evening. Come on, Father, what's your hurry? Jim Higgins reached out for the bottle and leaned over to pour a good 2 inches of its contents into the priest's brandy sniffer. One more for the road, okay? He said. Father Carmichael shrugged in mild protest, but Martha Higgins beamed and nodded at him from her chair beside the fireplace. Please don't rush away. Billy and Pat should be home soon, and I know they'd love to see you. I'd like that, the priest twirled his sniffer, then raised it to drink, smiling as he did so. Then, as he set the glass down again, his expression changed. Aren't they a little young to be out at this hour? It's trick-or-treat night, don't you remember? Jim Higgins swallowed brandy in a single swig that emptied it into his own snifter, and then emptied it into his own snifter. After all, Halloween only comes once a year. Praise the Lord for that, Father Carmichael said softly. Martha Higgins raised her eyebrows. Don't you approve of trick-or-treat? A harmless diversion, the priest told her, but Halloween itself. Now wait a minute, Jim Higgins spoke quickly, glancing out at Martha from the corner of his eye. This is a nice, friendly little town. You of all people should know that, Father. I realize a lot of parents are going out with their youngsters on a night like this, but we talked it over and decided it was time for Billy and Pat to make the rounds alone, if they wanted to. Sort of give them the grown-up feeling. Helps them to understand that there's nothing to be afraid of. Nothing to be afraid of, the priest sighed. Then, conscious of Martha Higgins suddenly frowning, he forced a smile. Don't mind me, he said. It's the brandy talking. What do you mean? Jim Higgins was frowning too. What's all this about Halloween? Are you trying to tell us we ought to be out, or we ought to be afraid of goblins and witches? I thought you people stopped believing in that stuff a couple hundred years ago. So they did. Father Carmichael took a hasty sip from his glass. They stopped believing. But that in itself didn't necessarily stop the phenomenon. Don't talk like a damn fool, Jim Higgins said, and then halted, his face reddening. Sorry, Father, no offense. None taken, the priest nodded. You're quite right, of course. We're all of us God's fools, for some of us, I fear, are damned. But I spoke as neither, merely in a capacity as a servant of the church. And though the church no longer concerns itself with suppressing old wives' tales about pixies and leprechauns, it should not abandon the fight against true evil. There are still those of us who are ordained to seek out and dispel the unclean and the unholy, or exorcise unfortunates possessed by demons. But isn't that a lot of superstition? Martha said. All this nonsense about vampires and werewolves and the dead coming out of their graves, and even if such things were possible, I don't see what it has to do with Halloween. It's just another holiday. Father Carmichael finished his brandy before speaking. The real holiday, holy day, that is, will come tomorrow on the Feast of All Saints. It is when we celebrate Hollow Mass in honor of Our Lady and all the matrons unknown who died to preserve the faith. The faith of Satan, the faith which Satan abhors? Sorry, kids. The faith which Satan abhors because it affirms the power of Almighty God. But Satan, too, has power, and he chooses to manifest his defiance on the eve of All Hallows by loosing the forces of evil, which he commands. The priest broke off, smiling self-consciously. Forgive me, I didn't mean to start preaching a sermon. And I hope you realize I was just speaking figuratively, so to say. Sure thing, Jim Higgins moved to his wife and put his hands on her shoulders. Just a little Halloween ghost story, right? Martha nodded, but her eyes were troubled, intent on Father Carmichael as he glanced at his watch again and then rose. Time I was leaving, he said. I'll take it I'll be seeing you both at Mass tomorrow? Martha gestured quickly. But you haven't seen the children yet. They should be here any minute. Please, Father, won't you stay? The priest hesitated, conscious that his smile had faded from her face and stared into her troubled eyes. Of course, he said, of course I'll stay. Then there was silence, except for the crackling of flames in the fireplace and the faint, faraway ticking of a clock. Jim Higgins frowned. Almost 10:30, he murmured. They promised to be back at 10 by the latest. The frown deepened. You'll pardon my language, Father, but where the hell are those kids? Heavenly, Irene Esterhay said. I mean heavenly. She lurched against the buffet table as she took another bite of her croissant. Try one, honey. They're so good. Howard Esterly shook his head. No time for that, he told her. We've stayed too long as it is. But it's such a lovely party, Irene turned, nodding towards the crowd of couples milling about the living room beyond her. Her voice rised above the babble of animated conversation. Besides, I want another drink. She lurched again, and Howard gripped her shoulder. You've had enough, he said. We're going home. Oh, Howie, you heard me. He guided her forward. Now pull yourself together and say goodnight to the host and hostess. Irene made a face. Must I? You must, Howard said. And she did, somehow managed not to slur her words as they exchanged farewells and made their way out to the driveway. Once in the car, with the windows open and the night air on her face, Irene sobered slightly. You mad at me, honey? No, Howard sighed. eyes intent on the road. I guess you're entitled to a little diversion once in a while, but you do realize what time it is. Irene focused her eyes on the illuminated dial of the dashboard clock. My God, you're right, it's almost 11. I had no idea. Her husband nodded. I know, and I didn't want to spoil your fun. It's just that I told Connie we wouldn't be so late. Maybe we ought to give her something a little extra, Irene said. She's always been so good about sitting with Mark, even when she does play the damn stereo on full blast. You can say that again, Howard muttered as they pulled up into the house. The wind was rising, sending surges of sound through the treetops. But the screech of the stereo echoed so loudly that even their voices were drowned out by its pounding beat as they left the car and moved up to the front door. Howard's thumb jabbed at the buzzer. Maybe I should use the key, he said. She can't hear anything over that racket. But as he fumbled in his pocket for the key, the door swung quickly in and Connie peered out. Oh, it's you, she said. Who did you expect, Michael Jackson? Howard scowled. I thought it was Mark, Connie's voice faltered. Mark? Irene moved to the hall, her forehead furrowing. You mean he isn't here? Please, Miss Esther Hayes. The girl gestured helplessly. I don't want you to be angry with me. I thought it would be all right. Her voice was muffled by the stereophonic stridency. Turn that thing off, Howard shouted. Retreating in the living room, Connie hastily obeyed and then turned to confront Esther Hayes' accusing stares. Now, what's this about Mark? Howard said. Where is he? Connie's gaze dropped and her own words became forced bravado. You know Bill Summers, that friend of his from down the street? Well, he came to the door and I thought it was just a trick-or-treat, but it turned out he wanted Mark to come out with him. Just around the block, he said, but he didn't want to go out alone. I told Mark no, he wasn't supposed to, and he had all the candy he needed right here. Besides, he didn't even have a costume. But Bill said it would be only for a few minutes and Mark was almost crying. He wanted to go so bad, so I figured why not let him go just as long as he promised to come right back and not to go off of the block. Besides, I told my boyfriend where I was sitting tonight, so he called the phone right in the middle of this thing that was going on, so... wait, so you mean you disobeyed our orders? There was no slur in Irene's voice now, only a sharp, shrill, sudden anger. You let him go. I'm sorry, I guess I wasn't thinking. Never mind that, Howard's voice hoarse, held apprehension as well as anger. How long ago was this? How long? Connie shook her head. I don't know, I mean... I was on the phone and then started playing the stereo like maybe around 10 o'clock. He's been gone for over an hour. Howard's face was grim. Maybe an hour and a half while you were sitting here blabbering with your boyfriend and listening to that goddamn rock crap. Connie began to cry, but Irene ignored her. She turned to her husband. Why don't you get in the car and take a turn around the block? He can't have gone that far. I hope to God you're right. Howard moved towards the hall. Meanwhile, you better get on the phone to the Somersets and see if Bill was brought back over there. Good idea, I never thought of that. Irene was already dialing as Howard started up the car outside. She could hear it pulling away as Miss Summers responded to her call. Hello, Midge? Irene spoke quickly. Sorry to bother you at this late hour, but I was wondering. Connie stood beside her, trying to control her sniffles as she listened. But Irene's words and the pauses between them told their own story, and when she at last hung up, she turned with an anguished face to the light of Connie and began to cry. You heard? Irene said. Bill's gone too. Then her voice broke. Oh my God, she rose. What's keeping Howard so long? The answer came as the car screeched to a halt in the driveway and Irene opened the front door to admit her husband. The night wind was cold, but what really chilled her was that he'd entered the realization that Howard was alone. No sign of him, he muttered. I covered everything for a half mile up and down. There's not a kid out anywhere. They wouldn't be at this hour, Irene nodded. But I know he's not at the Summerses. But maybe he and Bill stopped by somewhere else? I'm going to phone the Coopers and see. Don't bother, Howard said. I've just come from there, and before that I went to the Stutmans, and the new people, the Higgins or whatever their name is, their kids haven't come home either. But that's impossible. Do you realize it's past 11:30? She trembled, fighting back tears. Where could they be? Well, we'll find out, Howard brushed past her, striding towards the phone. I'm calling the police. The grandfather's clock began to boom its message of midnight as a pot-bellied Benjamin Franklin, a little Miss C, peered into the parlor at the left of the front doorway. I'm glad we used candy this time, she said. And that was a good idea of yours, giving money instead if the youngsters came to the door with their parents. It was dark in the parlor, and they only had a moment to stare through the shadows as the huddled forms of lying masses lied motionless within. How many are there? He said. 13, she beamed at him as the chimes came to an end. At least we won't be going hungry. Sergeant Lyncher kept his cool, but it wasn't easy. The station was like a madhouse. All those parents yelling and crying, and it took a team of 4 men just to get the questions and some facts instead of listening to wild guesses about kidnappers or crazies who put razor blades in Halloween candy. But in the end, he got it all together, using their statements to map out a route, putting through some phone calls to establish where each child or group of children was last seen. It turned out that everything must have happened somewhere within the area of 1 square block. Then he called in the backup and they started out. There were 4 black and whites assigned to each search, each with its quota of parents, and each taking a single side of the block as they went from door to door asking questions. On 3 sides, the answers formed a pattern. Various youngsters had knocked on the doors at various times, but all had been seen and accounted for. Sergeant Lyncher himself was in the 5th car, and to speed matters up, he took one end of the block while the 4th car started at the other. It wasn't until the 2 cars converged in the middle of the block to compare notes that he got his answer. Sid Ollie pulled up and got out, shaking his head. "They were here, all right," he said. "Stopped at every house back there right up until around 11. What did you find out? Anything?" Sergeant Lyncher took a deep breath. "Same as you." He glanced at the house directly behind him. "Folks in the place said Esther's kids and the Summers boy were there late, almost 11:30. What time did your people see them?" Sid O'Neilly shook his head. "They didn't." He shook his head. "That's funny." But there was no mirth in his eyes. For the eyes of the parents as they stared at each other at the spot where the trail ended, the space between 2 houses looming on either side of weed-choked vacant empty lot lying under a deserted Halloween moon.